My friends, I want to begin today with something a hospice nurse once told me, years ago, during a difficult stretch when I was caring for a dying friend and asking her, somewhat desperately, what she had learned from sitting beside so many people in their final weeks. She told me that in nearly 30 years of this work, she had never once heard a dying person express regret over caring too little about what others thought of them. She had heard the opposite countless times. She had heard people express deep regret over the years spent anxiously managing appearances, chasing approval, worrying over things that, from the vantage point of a final hospital bed, suddenly revealed themselves as almost entirely weightless. This conversation stayed with me for years, quietly working on something inside me long before I fully understood what it was doing. It was not until I reached my own 70s, watching the way certain peaceful older people around me seemed to move through their days with a lightness I deeply envied, that I finally understood what that nurse had been describing. These peaceful people had not necessarily achieved more, suffered less, or been blessed with easier circumstances than their more anxious peers. What set them apart, I slowly came to realize, was a very particular, quiet act of release. Somewhere along the way, often without ever announcing it to anyone, they had simply stopped caring about certain things that the rest of us were still exhausting ourselves trying to manage. I want to share with you today 7 specific things I noticed these peaceful older people had secretly released, often over many years and usually without any dramatic announcement to the people around them. I call this release secret not because it was hidden deliberately, but because it happened so quietly, so gradually, that even the people experiencing it rarely noticed the exact moment the caring finally stopped. I have spent the years since that conversation with the hospice nurse watching for this pattern everywhere, and I want to walk you through each of these 7 releases in some depth, because I believe understanding them clearly, even before you have released them yourself, can meaningfully lighten the years still ahead of you. I want to say plainly, before we begin, that none of what follows is a suggestion to stop caring about the people or principles that genuinely matter to you. This is not a lesson in becoming indifferent, careless, or withdrawn from the world around you. Every peaceful person I describe in the pages that follow remain deeply engaged with their families, their communities, and their own sense of integrity, often more fully than they had been during the years when these 7 particular forms of anxious caring still occupied so much of their daily attention. What they released was never care itself. It was a specific, narrow, and largely unnecessary flavor of caring that had quietly been costing them far more than it ever gave back in return. The first thing, they secretly stopped caring what strangers thought of them. For most of my life, and I suspect for most of yours as well, an enormous, largely invisible portion of daily energy went toward managing the impressions of people who, in the end, would barely remember our existence beyond the passing moment of an encounter. I used to rehearse conversations before ordinary errands, worry about how my clothing appeared to other shoppers at the grocery store, feel a genuine flush of embarrassment if I stumbled slightly on a sidewalk in front of people I had never met and would likely never see again. This constant, low-grade management of strangers' impressions consumed a portion of my daily energy I never fully accounted for until I began watching it disappear in the peaceful older people around me. I remember, quite specifically, watching an elderly neighbor of mine drop an entire bag of groceries on a busy sidewalk, oranges rolling in every direction, a small crowd briefly gathering to help retrieve them. Where I would have once felt my face burn with humiliation for several days afterward, replaying the scene anxiously in my mind, she simply laughed, thanked the strangers who helped her gather the scattered fruit, made a light-hearted joke about her own clumsiness, and continued on her way apparently untroubled within minutes. I asked her about it later, somewhat astonished by her ease, and she told me plainly that somewhere in her 70s, she had simply stopped believing that strangers' fleeting opinions of her were worth the enormous energy she had once spent managing them. This release did not happen for her, or for the many peaceful older people I have since observed, through some sudden philosophical revelation. It happened gradually, through the simple accumulation of thousands of small experiences proving that a stranger's momentary judgment, however uncomfortable in the instant, evaporated almost immediately and left no lasting mark on either party involved. Once this pattern had repeated itself enough times across enough years, the anxious anticipation that once preceded every public interaction simply began, quietly, to fade away, freeing an enormous amount of daily energy that had previously been spent managing an audience that, in truth, was barely paying attention in the first place. I have since come to believe that this particular release is often the first domino in a much longer chain, precisely because so much of our other anxious caring throughout life is quietly built upon this same foundation, the assumption that unfamiliar eyes are constantly assessing us and that their verdict genuinely matters. Once a person tests this assumption directly, through an embarrassing public moment survived without lasting consequence, the assumption itself begins to weaken, making every subsequent release on this list considerably easier to eventually achieve. I have noticed that peaceful older people who release this particular form of caring earliest in their lives tend to arrive at the remaining 6 releases more quickly and with less internal struggle than those who continue carrying it well into their later years. The second thing, they secretly stopped caring about keeping up appearances of wealth or success for decades. I quietly measured my own worth, and unconsciously invited others to measure theirs, against visible markers of material success, the size of a home, the newness of a car, the impressiveness of a career title still mentioned proudly at social gatherings years after retirement. I noticed, watching peaceful older friends of mine, that many of them had simply released this particular scoreboard entirely, no longer feeling any need to project an image of continued success or accumulation to the people around them. A retired executive I came to know well had, in his working years, driven an expensive car he could barely afford, purely to maintain an image among colleagues and neighbors he privately admitted he did not even particularly like. In his 70s, driving a modest, practical vehicle that would have mortified his younger self, he told me he had simply stopped caring whether anyone assessed his life as successful by these old material standards. What replaced this old scorekeeping, he explained, was a far quieter satisfaction in whether his days felt genuinely good to him, regardless of how they might appear to an outside observer still measuring by the old rules he had finally set down. I noticed this release often accompanied a broader shift away from comparison altogether, a subject I have discussed with you in earlier reflections. But this particular form of release, specifically around material appearances of success, deserves its own attention because of how heavily many of us, especially those of a certain generation, were taught to measure our worth by exactly these external markers throughout our working lives. Releasing this particular form of caring did not require these peaceful elders to become genuinely poor or to abandon reasonable comfort. It simply required them to stop performing a level of success, real or exaggerated, purely for an audience whose opinion, they eventually realized, mattered far less to their actual daily peace than the performance itself had once demanded. I want to note something else I observed consistently among the peaceful older people who released this particular form of caring, a genuine curiosity, sometimes even amusement, about how much of their earlier spending and choices had been driven by this old scorekeeping rather than any authentic preference of their own. Several described going through old belongings in their 70s and being struck by how many purchases from decades past had clearly been chosen to impress rather than to genuinely please themselves, a realization that arrived with more gentle humor than regret. This retrospective clarity, several told me, made the release itself feel less like a sacrifice and more like finally arriving at a taste and a standard of living that had been authentically their own all along, buried for decades beneath the performance. The third thing, they secretly stopped caring about winning every disagreement. I spent much of my adult life believing that losing an argument, even a minor one over an unimportant subject, represented some small defeat I needed to avoid whenever possible. I would continue defending a position long after the actual stakes of the disagreement had become genuinely trivial, driven by something closer to pride than any real investment in the outcome itself. Watching peaceful older people navigate disagreements taught me something I had never fully appreciated in my younger years, the remarkable ease of simply letting an unimportant argument go, even one you privately still believe you are right about. An old friend of mine, a man who had built a career arguing cases in courtrooms and rarely backed down from a debate throughout most of his professional life, described a distinct shift he noticed in his own 70s. Disagreements with his adult children, particularly over matters of little lasting consequence, began to feel genuinely unimportant to win in a way they never had during his working years. He told me he began simply saying, quite sincerely, "You may be right," or "let's leave it there," far more often than his younger self would have ever considered acceptable, not from any diminished conviction in his own views, but from a genuine, secretly developed indifference to whether he emerged from every minor disagreement as the officially declared winner. This release brought him, he told me, considerably more peace within his family relationships than decades of successfully winning arguments ever had. The relationships themselves, he noticed, grew warmer once the need to win every exchange quietly fell away, replaced by a simple willingness to let smaller disagreements dissolve naturally rather than fighting each one to a definitive conclusion. He described this shift as one of the more surprising gifts of his later years, precisely because he had spent decades believing that being right, and being seen to be right, was an essential part of his own identity and self-respect. He also told me something I found particularly striking during our conversation, something about the specific quality of relief that followed this release. He said that winning an argument, even one he genuinely cared about, had always produced a strangely hollow satisfaction, brief and quickly replaced by the anticipation of the next disagreement he would need to win as well. Letting an argument go, by contrast, produced an immediate and lasting sense of ease that seemed to last far longer than any victory ever had. This asymmetry, once he noticed it clearly, made the choice to release his old need to win feel less like a sacrifice of principle and more like a straightforward trade toward a much better and more durable kind of satisfaction. The fourth thing, they secretly stopped caring about attending every social obligation for most of my life. Declining a social invitation felt like a small moral failure, a breach of some unwritten obligation to remain visibly present and available at every gathering I was invited to attend. I noticed, among the peaceful older people I came to admire most, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift away from this obligation, replaced by a far more selective approach to how they spent their remaining social energy. A widow I knew well described attending nearly every invitation extended to her throughout her 30s, 40s, and 50s, often at real cost to her own energy and genuine preferences, simply because declining felt unacceptably rude. In her 70s, she told me, she finally released this old obligation almost entirely, attending only the gatherings that genuinely interested her and declining the rest with a simple, warm, unapologetic note of regret that required no further justification or lengthy explanation. She was somewhat surprised, she admitted, at how little backlash this shift produced. Most people, she discovered, accepted her selective attendance graciously, and the relationships that mattered most to her actually seemed to deepen once her presence at gatherings reflected genuine desire rather than dutiful obligation. This particular release, I have noticed, often produces an unexpected secondary benefit. Peaceful older people who have stopped caring about attending every social obligation frequently become more genuinely present and engaged at the gatherings they do choose to attend, since these are now selected purely from authentic interest rather than obligation. The quality of their remaining social energy, concentrated only where it is genuinely wanted, tends to produce richer, warmer interactions than the exhausted, obligatory attendance of earlier decades ever managed to provide. I have also noticed that this release requires a particular kind of honesty many of us find difficult to practice at first, namely an honest accounting of which invitations we genuinely wish to accept versus which ones we accept purely from guilt or habit. The widow I described to you admitted that in the earliest months of practicing this release, she sometimes struggled to distinguish authentic desire from old obligation, occasionally declining something she later realized she would have genuinely enjoyed, or attending something she later wished she had skipped. Over time, with practice, she told me this discernment became considerably clearer and more reliable, until she could usually sense within moments of receiving an invitation whether her honest answer was yes or no, without needing days of anxious deliberation to arrive at a decision that had, in truth, been obvious to her all along. The fifth thing, they secretly stopped caring about following every piece of family advice or criticism. I want to be careful in describing this particular release, because it does not mean these peaceful older people stopped listening to their families entirely or became dismissive of loved ones' genuine concerns. What I noticed, rather, was a quiet release of the old compulsion to seriously weigh and often ultimately follow every single piece of unsolicited advice or criticism offered by well-meaning family members, particularly regarding personal choices that carried little genuine risk to anyone but themselves. An old friend of mine described spending decades anxiously adjusting her own choices, from her diet to her hobbies to her living arrangements, based on a steady stream of unsolicited suggestions from her children and siblings, most of it well-intentioned but exhausting to continuously accommodate. In her mid-70s, she described a gradual, quiet shift towards simply thanking family members warmly for their input while continuing to make her own choices regardless, no longer feeling obligated to seriously reconsider her own preferences every time a relative offered an opinion she had not actually requested. This release, she told me, did not diminish her relationships with her family the way she had once feared it would. If anything, her family members seemed to relax somewhat once they understood their advice, while always welcome to offer, was no longer expected to reliably alter her behavior. The relationship shifted from one resembling an ongoing negotiation over her own life choices into something closer to genuine companionship, freed from the low hum of quiet tension that had once accompanied every well-meaning suggestion she had previously felt obligated to seriously entertain. She described one particular moment that crystallized this shift for her clearly. Her daughter had once again suggested, with genuine concern, that she consider moving to a smaller, more manageable apartment closer to family. In earlier decades, this suggestion would have triggered weeks of anxious internal deliberation, guilt over disappointing her daughter if she declined, and considerable second-guessing of her own preference to remain in her current home. Instead, she simply thanked her daughter warmly for the concern, explained clearly that she intended to remain where she was for now, and the conversation moved easily on to other subjects within minutes, with no lingering tension on either side. This ease, she told me, had taken years of quiet practice to develop, but it eventually became almost effortless once the underlying compulsion to seriously reconsider every piece of advice had genuinely fallen away. The sixth thing, they secretly stopped caring about having a perfectly organized or impressive home for decades. I maintained a level of household tidiness and visual presentation that, looking back honestly, served an audience of occasional visitors far more than it served my own genuine daily comfort. I noticed, among peaceful older people I came to know, a quiet release of this old standard, replaced by homes organized instead around genuine daily use and comfort rather than the impression they might make on an occasional guest. A retired homemaker I knew well described spending much of her adult life maintaining an immaculate, magazine-ready living room that her own family rarely used comfortably, reserved instead for the rare occasions when impressive guests might visit. In her 70s, she described gradually converting this formal, rarely used space into a comfortable reading room she and her grandchildren actually enjoyed daily, releasing an old standard of household presentation she eventually realized had served appearances far more than it had ever served her own actual daily life and genuine comfort. This release extended, for many peaceful older people I observed, into a broader ease around minor household imperfections that would have once caused them genuine distress. A slightly cluttered counter, an unmade guest bed, a garden bed with a few visible weeds, these small imperfections, once sources of quiet anxiety, gradually lost their power to disturb their peace once the underlying motivation for perfect household presentation, namely an audience's judgment, had itself been released. Their homes, freed from this old performance, became genuinely more comfortable and more truly theirs than the carefully staged versions they had maintained for so many earlier decades. I remember visiting this particular friend's home a few years into her renovation of that old formal living room, and being struck by how different the entire atmosphere of the house felt compared to my memory of visiting decades earlier. The old formal room, once immaculate and rarely used, had been replaced by a comfortable, slightly worn reading nook filled with well-loved books, a favorite blanket draped over the armchair, and several of her grandchildren's drawings taped unceremoniously to the wall beside the window. It was, by any old standard of household presentation, considerably less impressive than the room it had replaced. It was also, unmistakably, a far warmer and more genuinely inhabited space than the pristine room I remembered from years before, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, envying the ease with which she had let the old standard go. The seventh thing, they secretly stopped caring about being seen as consistently youthful or physically impressive. The final release I want to describe to you today may be among the most significant, because it touches on something many of us carry with particular intensity as we age, a quiet, persistent desire to still be perceived as youthful, vigorous, and physically impressive well past the years when this perception could realistically be maintained. I noticed, among the most peaceful older people I have known, a gradual, quiet release of this particular desire, replaced by a genuine ease with their own changing appearance and physical capacity. A retired athlete I knew well had spent decades of his life deeply identified with his own physical vigor and impressive appearance, continuing to compare his changing body against his younger self well into his 60s with considerable private distress. In his 70s, he described a gradual shift he had not consciously chosen so much as simply noticed arriving. The comparison to his younger self quietly fell away, replaced by a straightforward acceptance of his current body exactly as it now was, with its particular aches, its slower pace, its visible signs of age, none of which any longer felt like evidence of failure or diminishment requiring correction or concealment. This release, he told me, brought him a peace with his own physical existence that decades of disciplined maintenance of his youthful appearance had never actually provided. He no longer dyed his hair to hide the gray that had once felt unacceptable to him. He no longer avoided mirrors on days he felt less vigorous than usual. He simply inhabited his current body, at whatever stage it happened to be in on any given day, without the exhausting internal commentary comparing it unfavorably to some earlier, more impressive version of himself that had, in truth, belonged to an entirely different chapter of his life. I asked him once whether he missed his younger physical vigor, expecting perhaps a wistful answer given how central that vigor had once been to his sense of self. His answer surprised me. He said he certainly noticed the absence of certain capabilities he once had, and he would not pretend the changes were entirely without loss. But he said the specific suffering he had experienced for years, the anxious comparison and quiet shame about his changing body, had disappeared far more completely than the physical vigor itself ever had, and this particular suffering, he told me plainly, had been optional all along, a story he had chosen to attach to his changing body rather than an unavoidable consequence of the changes themselves. Releasing that story, rather than releasing the changes, was what had ultimately brought him his peace. My friends, I want to be honest with you that releasing these 7 forms of caring did not happen instantly for any of the peaceful older people I have described to you today, and I do not believe it happened instantly for me either. In the smaller ways I have managed to release some of these old patterns in my own life. Each release, in every case I observed, arrived gradually, through many small experiences accumulating quietly over years, until one day these peaceful people simply noticed the old caring had faded away almost entirely, without any single dramatic moment marking its departure. I think it is worth saying plainly that releasing these forms of caring is not the same as becoming careless, indifferent, or disconnected from the people and standards that genuinely matter. Every peaceful older person I have described to you today remained deeply engaged with their families, their communities, their own sense of personal integrity. What they released was not care itself, but a particular, exhausting flavor of anxious caring about matters that, upon honest examination, contributed remarkably little to their own genuine well-being or to the well-being of anyone they truly loved. The energy once spent on these 7 forms of anxious caring was simply redirected toward the things that actually mattered to them, producing a life that felt, by every account I gathered, considerably lighter and more genuinely their own. If you are watching this today and you recognize even one of these 7 forms of caring still quietly governing your own daily choices, I want you to know that releasing them does not require a dramatic announcement or a sudden, sweeping transformation of your entire personality. It can begin far more modestly, with a single declined invitation offered without excessive apology, a single minor disagreement allowed to simply dissolve without needing to be won, a single morning spent without checking the mirror for evidence of decline. These small releases, repeated patiently over the months and years still ahead of you, may well accumulate into the same quiet, hard-won peace I have watched so many remarkable older people around me eventually discover, often without ever fully realizing, until they looked back, just how much lighter their lives had gradually become. I want to leave you with one final thought before we close. Every single release I have described to you today shares a common feature worth naming plainly. In every case, the peaceful person did not lose anything of genuine value by letting go of the old form of caring. The stranger's opinion was never actually essential to their well-being. The appearance of wealth never actually produced deeper happiness than the reality of their finances already provided. Winning every argument never actually strengthened the relationships it was meant to protect. What they released, in every single instance, was not a genuine good traded away for peace, but rather an old, exhausting habit that had never actually been serving them in the first place, mistaken for years as something essential simply because they had carried it for so long without examining it honestly. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize one small form of unnecessary caring you might be ready to gently release, and the freedom that release may eventually bring to the years still ahead of you. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Let go of what no longer truly serves you, gently and in your own time. And trust that the peace so many remarkable older people around us have quietly discovered remains just as available to you, one small release at a time. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay light, stay honest, and remember, sometimes the most peaceful thing we can do is simply stop caring about the things that were never truly worth the weight we gave them. Thank you for watching.